I'm in the chamber. So sorry, Chairman.
No, it's fine.
This is an unusual reading for us.
It is very, isn't it?
Sorry.
Really good.
Sorry, it's awful.
Order, order. Secretary of State, can I welcome you to the meeting of the International Trade Committee. Very interesting week. Good to have you with us on many ways, I can say. Can I just kick off by asking you how the position agreed at Chequers last Friday, if accepted by the EU, how will that affect your ability to make trade deals with non-EU countries after Brexit? What's happening?
Well, thank you, Chairman, and I'm sorry to have upset your babysitting arrangements today. The Chequers Agreement was designed to be, first of all, a credible offer to the European Union to take negotiations forward. It had to respect the referendum, a no customs union, no single market, no freedom of movement, no ECJ jurisdiction. And its aims were to maximise continuing trade with the EU while allowing us to take opportunities of other trade agreements, to minimise friction at the borders and to ensure no hard border at the Northern Ireland interface.
And has it
We
achieved
believe
all those things?
Sorry?
Has it achieved all those
Well,
things?
we think
no border, no customs union.
And we think it's possible to do that within the agreement. It is, of course, an offer to the European Union, and it's up to the European Union now to respond, and we hope that they will respond positively to that. In terms of our future trade agreements, yes, we think it is possible to negotiate independent trade policies after we leave the European Union.
Policies
but
or
of course,
agreements?
we will have to see what the final
I just
positions
want to
are.
clarify a word there. Is that policies or trade agreements?
Trade agreements.
Trade agreements, okay.
So, but it will depend on the European Union's response to what we want.
Okay, so all's rosy in the garden after Chequers, from what you've said there. What happened to the former DEXU Secretary and what happened to the former Foreign Secretary that didn't have this enlightened understanding of Chequers that you seem to have, Secretary?
Not for me to comment, Chairman, since it's not within my departmental remit.
So has Cabinet collective responsibility and discipline been restored?
Well, the members of the Cabinet who couldn't accept collective responsibility are no longer members of the Cabinet.
If you find yourself unable to make trade deals in the short term, medium term or long term, would you consider resigning yourself, or would you feel that the job of the Department of International Trade is so important in promoting trade that trade is actually more important than trade deals?
I've never regarded failure as an option.
If failure occurs, what happens?
That's a hypothetical.
So you don't think of any possibilities that could happen, you just think of one person. There is no plan B.
When I go around the world and people show the enthusiasm that they do for looking at opportunities for increased trade with the United Kingdom, that's what reassures me.
Catherine West.
Thank you, Chair. Given that traditionally you've taken a similar position to Mr Johnson and Mr Davis, I'm just wondering why it is that you didn't take the same course of action that they did, given that Chequers does seem to run contra to many of the things which you've stood up and talked about publicly for the last 18 months.
Well, I've said what the agreement was meant to achieve, and I believe in collective responsibility.
So you won't seek to, if the customs agreement means that it does prohibit other trade deals with other parts of the world, you would just carry on?
I don't believe it does.
Isn't that cakeism?
I think it's an assessment based on what our officials have made of the contents of the agreement.
Mr. Secretary of State, if you have yourself in a situation where you have no border in Ireland, you can only achieve that by not having a different customs, by being inside the customs union and the single market. In that situation, you cannot have your own trade agreements. It would be an impossibility. The circle the UK government is refusing to square is the promise to the Conservative backbenchers of no customs union, no single market, and the promise to Ireland, the European Union, of no border in Ireland. You're saying you can't square that circle.
We're not saying, we've said that we're leaving the customs union and we're leaving the single market.
Therefore,
not least, Chairman, because 80% of the voters who cast a vote at the last general election did so for parties who said they would respect the referendum, which meant not being in the customs union or the single market.
Therefore, will there be a border in Ireland?
Well, we have said that we want there to be no hard border between Ireland, Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic. We've also said that we can't accept one of the EU's options, which was to put a border down the Irish Sea. I am a Conservative, but before anything else, I'm a Unionist, and I believe in the unity of the United Kingdom.
What difference would there be between a border in the Irish Sea and a border in the island of Ireland? Would one be a hard border that would rent the UK asunder, and would the other be a very soft border that wouldn't matter at all in the island of Ireland? Because it seems you can't have it both ways. You can't say that a border on the Irish Sea is a huge edifice that's going to rent the UK asunder, but then say a border in the island of Ireland is nothing.
Ireland is not part of the United Kingdom. Northern Ireland is. So Northern Ireland must be treated as a part of the United Kingdom in terms of what we do, in terms of our laws.
But my final point to you at the moment is, if you do have a border on the island of Ireland, you are imperiling and putting at risk a possible transition agreement which has huge implications for manufacturing in the United Kingdom. If you have that hard border, you might find yourself, you're risking the UK being out of the European Union with no further transition agreement in March 2019. Is that a risk you're prepared to take?
Though we have said we don't want there to be a hard border in Ireland.
You want everything, but you realise some of these things are mutually exclusive. You can't have all the things you want. You've got to give them some things.
Well, the model that was set out by the government after Chequers is designed to ensure the integrity of the United Kingdom and designed to ensure that we can reassure the European Union that there would be no way in which the integrity of the single market would be undermined.
Thank you. Marcus Fish.
Thank you, Chair. How likely, in your assessment, is the EU to accept this customs arrangement solution?
Well, that's of course impossible for me to say at the moment. One can imagine what might be the sort of objections that might come forward. But what I hope that we achieve is that we focus the debate on the economic well-being of the EU 27 and not on the abstractions of the Commission. I think we need to get away from the arguments about the purity of ever closer union and get towards working solutions that will actually make trade continue to be possible.
But so does the EU have similar arrangements with any other nation, any other of its neighbours?
No, this is a completely unprecedented set of options being put forward. But then no country has ever left the European Union before, and of course there are no clear mechanisms set out under the Lisbon Treaty about exactly how a country would disaggregate from the European Union. So everybody is in a position where this is a new situation that needs to be dealt with, which is why I say the government have put forward what I believe to be a credible proposition for the European Union, and I hope they will deal with that, because I think that we need to understand across Europe what some of the implications would be if we are unable to get an agreement and we move to a no-deal scenario. The pain that would occur would not be evenly spread across Europe, and you could see it having a disproportionate impact on economies such as the Netherlands or Belgium or Ireland. And so that's why I say it needs to be about the EU 27. It needs to be about the actual countries with elected governments that need to get prosperity and jobs and trade if those politicians want to get re-elected.
It is fair to say, though, isn't it, that no other set of countries have a free circulation of trade between them unless they are part of a customs union. Is that what is really meant by the term common customs territory?
No, because it relates only to the regulations required for friction-free trade at the border, not even all regulations of all goods, never mind not services and not data, for example.
So would there not, in that case, be the need for checks still to be made about different types of goods if there were different regulations? I mean, how is that going to happen without the full single market, rather than bits of it that are deemed to be relevant to particular bits of trade? Excuse me, sorry. Turn that off. No.
Mr. Fisher.
Sorry, Ben.
Not at all. So in coming to the new customs facilitation model, HMRC looked at the total trade that occurred at the present time and estimate that around 4% of UK goods trade in 2017 was of imports of intermediate, that is unfinished products, for which tariff differentials with the EU could arise as a result of an independent UK trade policy. And it might help, Chairman, if I actually give some of those HMRC numbers. 74% of our goods trade in 2017 was with the EU or exports to non-EU countries, for which tariff differentials at the UK border are not relevant under the model. Of the remaining 26% of goods trade that is imports from non-EU countries, 13% of the total currently face zero EU MFN tariffs, and 4% come from EU FTA partners or from less developed countries. And tariff differentials are unlikely to emerge in those areas because the UK is not likely to increase its tariffs as we leave the European Union. Of the remaining 9% of UK goods trade where tariff differentials are more likely to arise, 5% of the total are in finished goods, where it must be, I think, by definition, where we assume that they're likely to pay the correct tariffs at the UK border. Only 4% of this trade is estimated to potentially be subject to the regulations and the rebate mechanism. And that's an example, a carburetor or a battery that may end up in the EU and not the UK, which might be liable for all of or part of EU duties.
So I've had conversations with representatives of some of the larger member states in Europe and their customs authorities, and one of the concerns that they've raised with me is their perception that as things stand, there is a large amount of trade which is imports from the rest of the world that comes into the EU, and it makes its way into the that comes into the UK rather, and it makes its way into the EU without having been declared properly in that process, and they already feel very vulnerable on that front. I'm thinking in particular of, for example, small packages containing textiles, that type of thing. They think they're already hemorrhaging a lot of potential tariff revenue that way. What makes you think that the EU would ever agree to some sort of honesty box solution whereby they agree to the UK to collect its tariffs for them?
Well, it would be written to treaty for a start, but our trade, large amounts of trade, are dependent on trust and on people obeying the rules. But obviously that's something that we would want to discuss with the EU. As I say, this is our initial and credible offer. They will want to come back on that, and these issues are issues for HMRC and the Treasury in particular to take up.
Thank you. Chris Leslie.
Well, obviously, Secretary of State, I'd like to go a little bit further, but can I just take the opportunity to say how delighted I am that you've come round to the idea of a common rule book for goods. I think this is progress. Could you just share your enthusiasm for this with the rest of the committee?
As I said, we looked at what were the credible offers we could make to the EU and what was workable. And we decided that of the options that were available to us, that the EEA Plus was not acceptable because of free movement, that the EU's default position of FTA Plus was unacceptable as they would insist on a border down the Irish Sea, and that a facilitation model was the one that best met all the criteria the government had set.
But you're keen on the common rule book for goods?
Well, that's the way that we think we maintain the maximum access to EU trade and allow ourselves to have an independent trade policy. There were none of the options available actually 100% were able to meet all the tests that the government has set.
It's just that you're kind of giving out the vibes of enthusiasm of somebody left polishing a piece of waste of some sort.
So your interpretations are entirely your own.
So if we're in a common rule book for goods, though, Secretary of State, it'd be difficult for you to do trade deals externally beyond the EU on goods, wouldn't it?
Well, that would depend on the level at which that we applied regulations. If it was all regulations on good in every respect, that clearly would have diminished offer. But it's not. It's only on the goods rules that are required at the border. For example, SPS, but not on things like labelling, for example.
But a common rule book kind of means common rule book. I mean, I was interpreting it as really the area where you're left to work is free trade agreements, perhaps in services. That sort of was. I was sort of interpreting the reason for you to still have a Department for International Trade is really if you're not realistically going to have much wiggle room for non-EU FTAs on goods, perhaps it's enthusiasm for trade agreements on services that you're now focusing on. Have I got that wrong?
Well, of course, as I've said, I think to this committee before, if you look at our trading performance, 61% of our trade outside the European Union is in services. And if you look at the IMF projections of 90% of global growth being outside Europe, it's very likely that a high proportion of that demand will be in services. And as I've said again in this committee and elsewhere, the real advances in terms of UK potential trade gains lie in things like the Trade and Services Agreement and other forms of liberalisation of trade. In fact, of course, in discussions elsewhere, we've been very focused on what access to service markets might mean for the UK, including places like China.
I'm just worried that it's a bit theoretical, the idea of free trade agreements on services. Can you name me a bilateral comprehensive free trade agreement on services from somewhere else in the world?
No, we have said often that we have to be able to put things on. If you're looking for a comprehensive FTA, for example, we have to make all things available. If we are making less of an offer on goods regulation, we might have to make a bigger offer on market access elsewhere.
So that you can't name another services FTA
We
anywhere?
We're not looking for replicating here what's been done elsewhere.
Okay.
Thank you. Brief question, Mr. Nisley, before I go to Julia.
President Trump's coming Thursday, Friday. We're all looking forward to the visit. Are you meeting him?
I am.
Right. Or do you expect to?
I am, and it's not that I'm being reticent about giving information. It's just that, as everyone around the committee will know, sensitivities around movements and meetings is high.
No, I know. Do you expect to talk about trade with him?
I would imagine that was a likely topic.
Do you think he'll be disappointed by the Chequers deal?
I think that in terms of the US, their main attention at the moment is towards their trade friction with China and the implementation of the 232 agreements already in place on steel, potential 232 implementation on automotive, and the 301 on Chinese IP. I think there's a tendency in Britain to think that Brexit is the most important issue for everybody else in the world. And the further you get from Westminster, the less true I believe that becomes.
I talk of little else, as you know.
I believe that in Missouri the bars are filled with people talking about Brexit.
Well, I suspect they're not talking about chlorinated chicken either, but as far as the trade deal with the USA is concerned, let's say, because the President wants to do one, he's put us at the front of the queue, but chlorinated chicken can't be part of that. Now, I don't think anybody in Britain's going to lose any sleep about not being able to buy chlorinated chicken. But how about other goods? This is not services coming from America into the United Kingdom. What else is now not going to be allowed to be imported into the United Kingdom by the Chequers deal?
Well, the question would there be of importation of different standards?
Yes.
And the question there would be, would it be possible, for example, to have a UK mark for goods sold only in the UK but not in the EU, but not the CE mark?
Yes.
And that's something that we would want to discuss in future with the EU.
So any car could be imported from America into the United Kingdom? A Ford car?
Well, not at the present time, and not under this agreement, unless there were to be a derogation that allowed a UK mark that identified something as a UK market only.
And who gives that derogation? Who gives the derogation?
Well, that would be something that we would have to discuss with the European Union as part of this discussion.
So we'd be a rule taker from the European Union as to whether we can import a car from the United States of America into the United Kingdom?
Well, it would depend on what was in the treaty that we arrived at.
With who?
The treaty between the United Kingdom and the European Union.
Right.
So that's not a discussion that I'm aware that has been had, but it is a theoretical discussion that would be possible to have as part of these discussions.
Well, it's just that the American ambassador, Woody Johnson, was talking about zero tariffs between American goods coming into the UK and the other way around, and I thought that that was something that you would want.
Well, that's a slightly different matter because tariffs and non-tariff barriers are not the same. I'm actually in favour, as Mr. Evans knows, of moving towards global liberalisation, where we see the gradual elimination of tariffs and of non-tariff barriers. And actually, if you look across this decade, it's not the erection of tariffs that's been the problem in the global economy. It's been the willingness, particularly of G20 countries, to introduce non-tariff barriers to trade, where we've seen a big increase in the numbers since 2010.
I'm actually moving on. Marcus Fish, very briefly, and then Julia Lopez, as I promised.
Just two things on that. One is the idea of the UK mark, a UK-only mark. How would the EU feel about the free circulation, which is what's designed to occur through this system, of UK mark products going across into France?
Well, that would.
I mean, how does that not create the sort of borders that you say are going to be eliminated by this process? And the second thing, does the Chequers Agreement not also prohibit effectively our pharmaceutical industries here working more closely with the US ones to help actually deliver better drugs more cheaply into our healthcare services here in the UK?
It's a very good and a very interesting question. We've held considerable discussions with the pharmaceutical industry. I've had discussions with them. I had them in Switzerland. I had them in the UK. And basically there are two regulatory models available. There's either EMA or FDA. Now, there was discussion, should there be a third way? Should there be a UK regulatory framework? But frankly, the UK market's too small to support that. And all our pharmaceutical producers are either selling into the United States, in which case they manufacture to FDA standards, or largely EMA standards. And that's for them to decide. Some countries like Switzerland will accept both of them. But I've not detected, I have to say in all honesty, any desire for UK companies currently using EMA standards to want to adopt anything else. And that's just what the industry themselves have told us.
Thank you. Can I move to Julia Lopez?
The Chequers deal talks about a common rule book. Do you think that's an honest term?
It's a rule book that is common.
So UK could introduce regulations that the EU would then also consider putting into its own market?
So what would happen would be at the point of exit, where we had regulations already in place, there would be an acceptance of those regulations, which is not that different from a regular free trade agreement.
Do you not think it would actually be more honest to call it an EU rule book that the UK applies?
No, because under current rules, for example, if there is an EU rule or directive, it becomes applied to the UK. We have a process where Parliament can scrutinise it, but it gets applied anyway. Under a common system based on treaty and dispute resolution, that does not happen, and there is no automatic application of EU law into the United Kingdom, as we are outside the EU treaties.
I think in reality the EU would have a much greater sway over the regulations in this country, and we would actually be ceding sovereignty because we wouldn't have a seat at the table anymore. And therefore you would introduce a huge incentive for the EU to introduce further regulations which would actually have a huge impact on UK businesses who could be disadvantaged by this new system.
Yeah.
Do you think that's a fair point for me to make?
And Parliament, unlike the current system, would actually have a lock that says we're not introducing that rule.
Do you think in reality that lock would be often used?
That would remain to be seen. It would be dependent on how those rules were interpreted. It would have to be looked at by any joint committee that was set up, which is, again, common in international agreements.
Given that we're going to be aligned to the EU's regulations, how comprehensive and valuable a trade deal do you think that we could arrange with the United States?
Well, the United States continues to be very keen on this, and this week we had 2 days of very good discussions. We discussed, for example, what we could do for SMEs and remove market access restrictions there, how we might look at mutual recognition of professional qualifications. We've been looking at what we might do in services. We had our first standalone session on financial services. Of course, any agreement, for example, on mutual recognition or equivalence between US and UK financial services would give us a very dominant global position.
Has your department modelled the benefits of an FTA under the Chequers scenario versus an FTA under a situation where the UK has a truly independent trading policy?
Well, given that we've had all of 3 days,
so you were able to make a decision without having a
that work is fully underway, and as I said at the beginning, the balance that was sought under this model was how could we maximise access to current trade and access future trade possibilities.
How likely do you think it would be that the US would accept a services-only trade deal?
I think it's unlikely to do a services-only trade agreement, if by that you mean a free trade agreement, because classically free trade agreements have to take into account most areas, and that's goods and services. There are other types of agreements, mutual recognition agreements, for example, equivalence agreements, that might actually achieve much of the same outcome in the areas that we would want, but they remain to be explored. And I think I said when I was at the committee the last time, I think that the trend in global trade is to move away from the concept of pure FTAs and to look to see what other tools are in the box to achieve trade liberalisation. Maybe the length of time it takes to negotiate a full FTA in the way that we thought about them in the past, a gold-plated FTA, may not be the way that we think of it in the future. And I think that there's a growing... Certainly, I had this strong impression at the WTO ministers' meeting in Buenos Aires that there was an appetite to look at different ways of liberalising global trade, and that the way that FTAs did it and the length of time it took FTAs meant that global trade patterns could very often have changed substantially even before those agreements came in.
There seems to be a substantial shift in language away from where we were a couple of years ago, when we were talking quite optimistically about the idea that we could sign a free trade agreement with the United States that would be extremely beneficial to consumers in this country and to businesses.
I'm sure we can. There are free trade agreements and free trade agreements. You can sign a free trade agreement. The New Zealand-Singapore, off the top of my head, free trade agreement was a free trade agreement. It's arguable how much liberalisation that ushered in. All I'm saying is that there are ways, I think, of getting the sort of liberalisation that in practice we want, globally, without necessarily the FTA being the only way in which we can do that. I think what's important are the results that we generate. How open will the global economy be? How successful are we in reducing non-tariff barriers? How do we get deregulation in that? How do we move towards global standards so that we're not having one bit of the world trying to write the rules for the rest? That's a major challenge for all free trading countries.
If we were seeking to get away from that, our close alignment with the EU, whereby we're going along with what they say on standards, would actually give them more power to have standards that suit them and put us further away from the idea of global standards.
There's a difference between standards. There's a difference between standards and regulations. So standards tend to be set at a supranational level. So most European standards actually will apply as much to Iceland and Norway and Turkey as they will to the EU, because those standards are set in terms of ease of doing business. Regulation is a different matter.
Thank you. Just before we move on to Ronald J. Warner, to pick up from a point from Julia Lopez there in your response, and just to sort of rent a phrase that's going to go at the moment, I think Julia Lopez was correct. The rhetoric seems to have changed. I mean, is the dream dying on a bilateral FTA with the United States of America? The rhetoric is not the same as it was 2 years ago, Secretary of State.
Well, it's if the United States wants an open trade agreement with the United Kingdom, which they say they do, then we're very happy to enter those negotiations with them. And as I said, we have had some very successful rounds, including this week, Monday and Tuesday this week, when we had the trade working group with the United States, which still shows a very strong appetite to do so. If they have the appetite, so do we.
We could go on with what we want in our appetites, but there are very physical, real red lines in the situation created by our commitments elsewhere that will put difficulties in that, and I'll just leave that hanging there. Ronald J. Wardner.
Thank you, Chairman. Just returning to this issue about the common rule book that Mrs. Lopez rightly raised, and indeed Mr. Leslie, I think, spoke for a number of people who would rather we were still members of the European Union regardless of the referendum result, in speaking about his delight for the common rule book and the Cabinet's agreement. That of course is always a problem. But the question is, how will we influence these standards if we're forced to adopt them regardless once we're outside the European Union? Ms. Lopez rightly said that, in my view, that this is the EU on the whole that's going to tell us what to do. But then you're saying something different. So how are we going to influence the EU's rules?
After, as I said, at the point we leave the EU, there is we are at identity in regulation, self-evidently following the passage of our legislation in the House of Commons. And that would be the normal position in any FTA, where we would agree that these were the common rules that we had. And then we would look to see how, if necessary, countries might be able to deviate from them and what the
Well, that wasn't the question. The question was, how would we influence the rules going forward? So say that there was a Rule A that said 1 + 1 is 2, and Rule A is to be changed to 1 + 2 = 3. How do we actually influence that?
I understand that, and that will be subject to the oversight of the Joint Committee. I can't really say more than that on that, because that is still subject to ministerial right round ahead of the White Paper, and that would be, I'm afraid, that would be a breach of collective responsibility, and I think we've had enough of that this week.
Well, I appreciate your candour. So then, could I ask the flip side? There was this ominous warning of the consequences that would be faced if we were to deviate. What are the consequences?
Well, that would depend on the interpretation of which rules were being changed. Did it make a material difference to the understanding of the common rulebook as set out in the treaty? Now, that has to be set out in the treaty, and then it has to be settled by dispute resolution.
So, could you give us a best case and worst case for those ominous consequences?
No, I don't think I could. I'm afraid that the White Paper will, in detail, set a great deal of this out. Had we been in a meeting next week, Mr. Chairman...
You're most welcome to come back, I'm sure.
And I'm sure I'll be invited.
So may I then
not promoted, of course.
May I then talk about pull you up on something you set out earlier, which is your belief in global standards? What are we doing today to champion more global standards so that, regardless of our rule book or otherwise with the European Union, those rules don't fetter our deals and our access to other markets?
It is, and that's got to be a major drive. And as we take up our independent seat on WTO, that is going to be one of the major drives that we have. As you know, we're already working with a number of other countries in, for example, on data, e-commerce, where we do require global rules to govern a global economy. And we think that the adoption of global standards would be very important. The question is how you do that. Do you do that by identity of regulation? Do you do that by proposed global harmonization? Or do you do that by equivalence? Now, I'm a great believer in equivalence based on outcome rather than identity of regulation, which I think is prescriptive and expensive, and the only people who truly benefit are lawyers. And I think that one of the trends, as I think I said when I met this committee after Buenos Aires, was that there is a growing feeling in the global trading world that we need to move to equivalence measures rather than identity of regulation.
Thank you. One final question, if I may, Chairman. In fact, it relates to something you said earlier around the United States. If I'm not mistaken, Chairman, we received evidence when we were speaking to members of the US Congress that they might well be open to a deal on specific sectors where those deals could be done sooner than a comprehensive free trade deal. So to tackle that negative narrative that might be thrust upon our relations with the US, actually, could you tell us what's being done today to identify those sectors that we think we could do a quicker deal on, and not just at the federal level, but at the state level? Because, of course, there are non-tariff barriers also.
Yes, the complexity of the United States and its federal structure makes any problems we encounter with our devolved administrations in the United Kingdom look easy. And there are, and that's why we've set up in our working groups sector-specific discussions. As I said, this week we had our first freestanding financial services discussion. At this point, because we can't negotiate anything while we're members of the European Union, is a question of really scoping out what's available. And then it's to say, what are the mechanisms by which we might achieve it? If we, for example, wanted service liberalisation, if we wanted financial service liberalisation, but we had to do it through a classic FTA, would we get into issues of SPS, as Mr. Evans has alluded, for example, that might make that a much more difficult task for us? Or are there other mechanisms where we might be able to move more quickly to the same goal? That is what we're scoping at the moment.
Do we need more people for that?
No, at the moment, if I have a constraint at the present time, and for once, this may be the only time in my life I would say this, it's not a treasury constraint in terms of finance, it is the availability of the sort of people that we're looking for.
So we do need more people.
If we have, well, there will be a need to continue to evolve in that. But if you're looking, for example, at specific skills that we may require, they don't really grow on trees.
No.
Just a point of clarification, and I think I'm speaking to devolved governments, the difficulties are with the Westminster administration and not vice versa. Nigel Evans, please. One question.
It depends on your outlook, Chairman.
It absolutely does.
If people ask me if I'm a glass half full man or a glass half empty man, I simply say I'm Scottish and the glass isn't big enough.
As I'm half Irish, I see the Respect Ireland gets forwarded by the UK government as opposed to Respect Scotland gets forwarded by the UK government. Mr. Nigel Evans.
Secretary, you may have noticed that the Brexit supporting members of this committee are not happy with this Chequers deal, and the other side are more happier with it. The only ministers that have resigned are Brexit supporting ministers. Not a single remaining minister has resigned because they're unhappy with the Chequers deal. It does appear to me that Ollie Robbins has taken control of the entire negotiation as far as goods is concerned and rammed us further away from the Brexit that the people of the Ribble Valley voted for. And there is an assumption that there's now been a capitulation and a sellout by the Cabinet to the European Union. What do you respond to that?
I say that what we were asked to do was to have no free movement, no EU jurisdiction, no continued payments to the European Union, no customs union, and no single market.
And if there is free movement by whichever mention of name, because we know that this mobility thing, and everybody is now fearing that that's the next red line to be crossed, will you resign?
Free movement would not be acceptable. To have free movement would be, in my view, a betrayal of what the people voted for in the referendum.
Or even a fudged free movement?
No, I think, for example, if what was mentioned earlier was services, Mr. Leslie mentioned about services agreements. For example, in services agreements, there's nearly always some mode 4 movement that goes with that. Can people move from one place to another? Is there, for example, free intra-company transfer? Can you move people with that? So there's always something that goes, that classically goes with that. That is a million miles away from what we've had as members of the European Union, which is the ability of EU citizens to come to the United Kingdom who have no job, but to come here on spec and to utilise our public services, whether or not they've ever contributed to them before. I think that is what's unacceptable.
If any EU citizen has got a job offer, will they be able, post-Brexit, to come here?
Well,
whoever they are.
That's dependent on what the government determines of its post-EU migration policy. My personal preference is that as we leave the European Union, we have an opportunity to create a level playing field for global talent, and that businesses should be able, within the constraints set by migration policy, to be able to choose individuals from any part of the world that fits the requirements for their employment. That's my personal view. That's not. We haven't come to any agreement on the future EU migration policy yet, but as I say, that is an area where I have a strong personal preference, which will not surprise Mr. Evans.
Before we move to Faisal Rashid, you do accept, Secretary of State, that in Treasury figures, the UK has been in deficit since 2001, but the one area of the UK, those living in the UK that are not in deficit, are actually in surplus, are the EU migrants who contribute more to the UK pot than they take out of the UK pot, as opposed to the rest of the citizens. I mean, when we're talking about migration, we have to be very careful of the bleed over these kind of arguments have. You would accept those facts from the Treasury, that the migrants pay more in than they take out?
For me, Mr. Chairman, this is a question of democracy. That the British public, have...
With respect, Secretary of State, I'm asking you, do you accept the facts from the Treasury that migrants pay more in than they take out? When you said they'd come to use services, can bleed over. I'm making sure that you also accept the fact they pay more in than they're taking out.
That may well be true, but that's not the point. The point is that the public have voted in a referendum to end a system of free movement. And that system of free movement.
And one of the consequences of that would be a greater deficit.
Well, no, I think I disagree with that. I think that's dependent. That's dependent. I disagree. That's dependent upon what migration and labour policy would look like post-Brexit, and whether the government decided to have a policy that was not about free movement, for example, but about the movement of labour that was required by British business, which is why I said to Mr. Evans, I think that giving preferential access afterwards would, I think, be a missed opportunity for us to have a level playing field with any potential imported labour from around the world.
As before I move to Faisal Rashid, I think those Treasury figures need to be checked and need to be understood by all departments, including your own. Faisal Rashid.
I don't think, I'm sorry, Chairman, but I don't think that is the question. The question is not whether any particular group...
With respect to Secretary of State, the question was what I asked, and you didn't answer the question I asked. You answered another question. Faisal Rashid.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Secretary of State, thank you for coming. You have called Australia, New Zealand your second highest priority in the free trade agreements. And when we can see Australia accounted for 1.2% of total UK exports and 0.5% for imports, overall it's 1.2% of UK total trade. I just want to know, how likely is a deal with Australia and New Zealand in light of Friday's plan?
Yeah, the Prime Minister spoke to the Prime Minister of Australia over the weekend, who suggested that he was still very keen to do a deal with the United Kingdom. I will set out to the House of Commons shortly the procedures that the government will follow for new free trade agreements, and subsequent to that we will set out the order in which we intend to consult on those agreements.
So,
but I had rather hoped that I would be able to tell the committee on both those points this afternoon, but as yet I don't have technical clearance to do so.
I appreciate you can't.
But I do hope to do so to the House of Commons before we rise for the summer recess.
Okay, I appreciate that. I appreciate you can't divulge much of the information, but what sort of opportunities do you think, when we are already doing 1.2% just with Australia? So why it is your second highest priority countries? What exactly opportunities you are looking?
Well, when we look at countries with which we want to do an FTA, it isn't purely economic. It never is. There's always a strategic element in that. We have a great deal of overlap with Australia and New Zealand, for example, in our legal system. We have a very common understanding of how we want free trade to be. And we see that every possible opportunity to liberalise trade should be taken. And so sometimes it's because it's the biggest economic opportunity, as in the United States, and sometimes it's because we think we can achieve that and there's a strategic element involved, as in Australia and New Zealand. Sometimes it's a combination of both. For example, as the Prime Minister said at the weekend, we are exploring with the CPTPP countries what that might mean. If you look, for example, just as an abstract, if you like, example, the CPTPP 11 countries, if you look at their GDP plus the UK, would be very similar to the EU minus the UK in terms of GDP. So you can see where liberalisation takes you. What we want to see, and the question about global standards was mentioned earlier, we see the UK's role as pursuing liberalisation wherever we can. We think that the current trend of the silting up of the global economy has to be put into reverse.
Sure.
And sometimes that will be with partners of very high economic value. Sometimes the value will be less. Sometimes we'll see opportunities in growing markets that may not be evident yet. And sometimes there might be a strategic element to be taken into account.
So this is all based on assumptions, it looks like. But anyway, I'll just move on to...
Sorry, but since we're talking about the future, it has to be based on assumptions, not on facts.
Yeah. So, you might be aware that Australia and New Zealand both have actually recently opened formal trade negotiations with the EU. So, how likely is it that the UK will be able to have a deal with those countries that is any different from what the EU secures?
Well, we've no idea. I mean, we would like, again, because we believe in trade liberalisation, we would like the EU to come to a deal with Australia and New Zealand. But we will explore that on a bilateral basis. But they've also made it clear to us that they're not against us exploring CPTPP, of which they're both members, at the same time. In fact, there might be an overlap were that to happen in terms of the processes themselves.
Okay, thank you.
Just a minor point, Secretary of State. When we started discussing with business in Australia and New Zealand about the most important thing that could happen, it seemed the Home Office had a huge role. What is the joint-up thinking in government, or the joint-up messaging in government, when 5-year work visas would be better than 2-year work visas, would be one of the most important things, quickest change that could happen for international trade, purely under the auspices of the UK government?
Of course, visas, Mode 4, is always one of the more sensitive elements in these negotiations themselves. So they would have to wait for negotiation.
But when you find the Home Office is a block on trade, what do? Do you make representation of the Home Office, or do you accept the Home Office? Currently, in my part, neck of the woods in Northern Ireland, with fishing boats tied up that can't sell stuff internationally because they can't get crews.
Well, of course, it has to be a whole of government judgment about that balance.
Do you make representations to the Home Office so that we can trade more?
I make regular representations to the Home Office.
on such matters?
On such matters.
Thank you. Chris Leslie.
So, Secretary of State, I mean, obviously, while I'm welcoming your acceptance of a common rule book on goods, I have to say the rest of the Chequers agreement left an awful lot to be desired, and not just because it kind of abandoned services, but in particular, this rather magical concept of the facilitated customs arrangement, the FCA, which is supposed to be the solution to borders and so forth. So I'd like to just press you a little bit to get you to explain and how the FCA, this facilitated customs arrangement, is going to work. In particular, how it's compatible with the World Trade Organization rules. Do you think it is something that is compatible with the legal framework of the WTO? It doesn't exist anywhere, does it?
Yeah, it doesn't exist. But first of all, I have to take issue with the question being slipped in there that we're abandoning services. What we're saying is because services is a very rapidly changing global environment, and unlike the goods acquis, which is relatively stable, not only is the goods agreements very volatile at the present time and very rapidly changing, but that's a much bigger part of the UK economy than goods are. But
we can differ on that.
We can
on the facilitated customs arrangement.
On the facilitated trade. Well, of course, the legal view is that if the European Union and the United Kingdom both agreed on that system, it would be much more likely to be WTO acceptable.
Okay.
That's the advice that we have at the present time. That is, of course, open to the WTO. It is a new system. WTO is a members system. My hunch is that if we are providing stability of trade and we're providing stability in the global economy, that's more likely to be acceptable than not. But that is a judgment, and that's a judgment that would need to be checked against the WTO reality.
So there are three areas where I'm quite concerned it doesn't comply with the WTO framework. And sorry for being technical here, but let's just go through some of those. So the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, Article 3, which is about this national treatment principle, where any WTO member has to treat imports identically to domestically produced goods that are the same, has to be treated in that domestic market the same way. How can a track and trace system, which is part of this facilitated customs arrangement, how can a track and trace system be deemed fair for imported goods? Because you'd be essentially continuing to treat those imported goods differently. So how could it be compliant with Article 3 of GATT?
Well, the goods would be treated the same, and they'd be within the same regulatory environment. It's simply were there to be a difference in tariffs, were the UK to move to a different tariff system, then the tariffs would be collected separately.
But the track and trace is obviously slightly different to the collection of the tariff, because that's about the continuing monitoring of goods as they go around the UK and so forth. That's a differential treatment of an imported good from a domestically produced good. Yeah?
I understand that. The mechanisms are set out in the white paper. They're set out in a later chapter of the white paper. So, but the question of WTO legality is something that were the EU to accept this, both the UK and the EU would have to test at Geneva.
So just the second one is, again, apologies for the technicality, GATT Article 24, which is this principle about whether the facilitated customs arrangement might fetter the UK making free trade agreements with the rest of the world, because we would be levying EU tariffs on imported goods coming in via the UK, and therefore breaching that GATT Article 24 principle that any free trade agreements have to eliminate tariffs substantially on all trade between territories. In other words, if Britain did a free trade agreement with Brazil or the United States or wherever, and we were still collecting EU tariffs on those goods coming in, that would be not compliant with that Article 24.
Well, of course, the rebate mechanism has never been tested. There is no precedent for that. So the question of whether that would be legally compliant with 28 is a different matter.
That's a problem you'd have to overcome.
It is. It's unprecedented. And as I said in answer to Mr. Fisher's question earlier, a lot of this is unprecedented. It's never been tried before. It's never been tested against WTO rules. It's never been tested against WTO legality. But the WTO is a members' organisation, and if the members' organisation decided that because this facilitated trade it was acceptable, then that would be so.
Well, the third legal wrinkle, which is partly why I worry that a facilitated customs arrangement can't actually get rid of customs controls, is to do with rules of origin, this notion of local content thresholds, which are needed where parties to a free trade agreement are supposed to have that common external tariff. So how could this facilitated customs arrangement get rid of customs controls if, for example, a car that's made in Britain, assembled with non-EU, non-UK parts, would of course would require the EU to levy tariffs on it, and for us to calculate how much of the component parts of that, if it were to then be exported onto the EU. Do you see what I mean? I don't know. I don't see how the rules of origin arrangements in the FCA fit.
Well, ROO is something that would have to be part of that negotiation with the European Union.
So we've got to overcome that problem as well.
Well, it is, as I said, unprecedented. This is a system that has never been replicated, that's never been tried before, and it's an attempt to be able to ensure that we don't get a hard border down the Irish Sea, that we maintain the issues that I mentioned to Mr. Evans, that we're outside the customs union and we're outside the single market.
But just to be very precise, you're not asserting that the facilitated customs arrangement solves those three problems and the border issue. You're saying that you're going to try and develop it in a way to do that, but it's not solved yet.
It is. It's an unprecedented area. It's an area of WTO law that's not been tested in a system like this before, and it will require us, were this to be adopted between the UK and the EU, for us to sort out some of those legal issues at Geneva.
Okay. Seems like a bit of a leap of faith there, especially when a friend of Mr. Donald Trump is doing what he's doing at the WTO. But anyway, leave that there. Marcus Fish.
Can I just say that seems to me to be an environment of complete uncertainty. If you, as Secretary of State, have no idea whether or not that's going to be acceptable to the WTO, I mean, it kind of goes back to my question before: how likely is the EU going to be to accept this? This is never going to work, is it?
Well, this is an offer. It's what we said we believe is a credible offer to the European Union. It's up to the European Union now to give us a reply. That's what we await.
So were those particular legal problems with the potential association agreement, shall we call it, were they raised in the Cabinet meeting on Friday?
Unsurprisingly, I'm not going to say what was discussed in detail at a Cabinet meeting, but it would be a surprise to the committee that we hadn't taken legal advice, and while we never disclose what exact legal advice is given to government, it would have been very unlikely that we didn't look at potential legal issues at WTO. But there is no way in a system that's never been tested before to know whether the WTO will regard them as compliant. All I can say is that in my discussions with the Director General at the WTO, where we have raised...
How long would it take, though, for the WTO to rule on such matters?
Well, as I was about to say, in my discussions with the Director General of the WTO, they said that they want to be as helpful as possible to achieve the aims that we've set out in terms of frictionless trade and no disturbance to the global trading system. They understand that Britain leaving the European Union is unprecedented, and they are very well aware that it throws up some wrinkles. But we have made it very clear, as I've said several times already, we have democratic considerations to take into account.
I mean, this facilitated customs arrangement agreed on Friday creates massive uncertainty for business about where the UK is heading, doesn't it?
Well, you know, the best way to minimise that is, of course, if you want to stay in the European Union. There's no change to the situation in the European Union if you stay in the European Union. There are no, and that's the last thing that I would be suggesting. And if I was keen on leaving the European Union when I voted to do so, I'm more keen today. I think
some of your colleagues do want to remain in the European Union in the cabinet, don't they?
I think that it is immaterial what people want when they look at the fact that all of us in the Conservative Party were elected on a democratic manifesto that said we were leaving the European Union, we were leaving the customs union, and we were leaving the single market. To people who don't understand that, I would give them a dictionary and ask which of the words democratic, referendum and binary they're unfamiliar with.
Indeed, because it appears that through this Chequers agreement, the government does seem to be opposing itself to the people of the UK who voted to leave these structures. This is a completely impractical arrangement. The EU is never going to agree to it in a blue fit. They're going to say customs union. And how much do you think your cabinet colleagues understand, other than you, about trade? Honestly.
I think that what is very clear is that we've been given an instruction from the British people, and under that instruction it's our duty to try to find a way in which, with that instruction in mind, we can maximise our trade with the European Union that we have at the present time, and we can maximise our trade outside, and that we maintain the other elements. That is not it's not an easy task, but this, we believe, is a credible offer to the EU. It's up to the EU now to make some concessions in terms of the position that they've already adopted, if they want to have a practical solution to the problem that we face, because one of the outcomes that is not on the table is the UK remaining in the European Union. And there are still, I'd say, I still have conversations abroad when people say, is Britain really going to leave? We are really going to leave.
But what if they just say, no, that's clearly unacceptable, you're completely mad? What if they say customs union? What are you going to do then?
We can't stay in the customs union. This is a credible offer to try to take forward some of the issues.
Some of your colleagues in the cabinet want us to stay in the customs union, though,
as I said, I think that is democratically...
Mr. Hammond wants us to stay in the customs union.
It's certainly not going to be drawn on to individuals, but I think it's immaterial.
Mr. Clark wants us
people
to stay
have
in the customs union.
People have to... Some people...
Is this set up to fail so that we stay in a customs union?
If we are unable to get an agreement, then we will leave with no deal. Because the other part of what we agreed at Chequers was to step up no deal preparations.
So that's very interesting, because what I just noted here was, from what Chequers had done, what you were saying today was, I thought that no deal Brexit would be dead, given all that industry said round about you. But you're saying that no deal Brexit is very much alive here today.
We don't want to have no deal.
But it's a real possibility.
But as the Prime Minister has said, no deal is better than a bad deal. That remains, and we're stepping up our no deal preparations, and we'll pass legislation in the House of Commons next week which enable us to make a reality if we have to leave without an agreement.
In what scenario can you imagine a government negotiating a deal that would be worse than no deal? In what scenario would you imagine in negotiating a deal that's worse than no deal? Would you not just stop at no deal?
A deal that kept the United Kingdom in the single market or the customs union against the will of the people would be worse than no deal, in my personal view.
My apologies. I don't want to talk to you further, but I have another meeting and I apologise. I need to go to it.
I'm sure that these conversations can continue offline.
Indeed.
And will.
I'm not going anywhere. I've got plenty of questions for you, and I'm astonished, Secretary of State, that you essentially say you would rather have no deal at all and go back onto WTO rules than accept a customs union. When a customs union was merely ruled out by the Prime Minister in her red lines in Lancaster House, it wasn't on the ballot paper. I mean, just as an actual matter of fact, the customs union was not on the ballot paper.
No customs union and no single market was in the manifesto of the Conservative Party.
But you didn't win a majority in Parliament in the last election, so your manifesto is immaterial.
And both major parties said they would respect the result of the referendum of leaving the European Union,
which didn't say on the ballot paper.
Which requires us to leave the customs union.
Can you just explain why do you feel that the referendum requires leaving the customs union?
Because I believe the referendum wanted us to take control of our borders, our laws and our money, and remaining in a customs union means we would be rule takers.
But you believe that, but it wasn't on the ballot paper, was it, factually?
You ask me what I believe and I tell you.
No, but was it on the ballot paper, yes or no?
Leaving
the customs union?
For the Conservative Party, I'm
talking about the ballot paper.
In our manifesto,
no
customs. Leaving the customs union and leaving the single market. I don't understand why that's a problem.
I'm really worried about this sort of kamikaze attitude that because you have a particular belief, whereas the referendum ballot paper in 2016 did not say leave the customs union, did it? Just as a matter of fact.
The customs union is a legal entity of the European Union. The single market is a legal entity of the European Union. We voted to leave the European Union. And, you know, it's quite confusing to me then. I'm told that, on one hand, the process that we're describing is too complex, and on the other hand, that it's kamikaze.
No. You can be complex and kamikaze at the same time, Secretary of State, as you're demonstrating amply. I just am quite concerned that, well, let's just say for sake of argument, Parliament insists that a customs union should be part of your negotiating strategy. Is that the point at which you'd resign?
Well, I think we've explored my resignation rather too much already, but I think that it's as far as I'm concerned, the electors that elected me said no customs union and no single market, and I have no intentions of voting for either of them.
Thank you, Captain West.
Last week we heard from, and I'm sure you read all the minutes of our committee, as good Secretaries of State should, we heard from the head of Heathrow Cargo. Life's too short. The head of cargo from Heathrow and a number of other experts in logistics. And I think we do have to separate ourselves from your colleagues' approach to F business, which is what Mr. Johnson said. And we do have to get real about the implications in the real world of these discussions. In the evidence session last Wednesday, the head of Heathrow and others did say that this may not have been their words, but the implication was that at the borders, the preparations are not ready for if we burst out without a deal. And I'm wondering what the department is doing for if these rows continue right down to the wire, and in the end, Mrs. May walks away. That is a serious concern for logistics companies, specifically in relation to, for example, the fact that right now we have smuggling problems with weapons, which are used in our constituencies by young people, sadly, to kill each other. We have problems with drugs which come in, which are not being adequately dealt with at the borders. So I guess one of the concerns that this committee has shown through its questioning is what will happen if suddenly we burst out without a deal and our borders are just not prepared for that.
Well, that's why we don't want there to be no deal. HMRC have already increased their expenditure considerably, but you would have to ask HMRC about the details of their expenditure and their expenditure plans. I believe that there will be a section that deals with that in the white paper. And the whole point of, and you know, the government accept that this is a novel structure that's being suggested, but the whole point is that we are able to guarantee the continuance of trade without the increase of risk.
Just a quick question there on no deal and deal. What would your preferred position be if we get to March 2019 or December 2020 and we have no deal? Would you look for an increased transition to sort out some of the complexities I think that between Mr. Fish and Mr. Leslie had, or would you just want to go and just let the complexities sort themselves out? I mean, what's your preferred? Because you've said a number of things here about deals and no deals. What do you want?
What I prefer is that we have a realistic view across Europe, that we should put the prosperity of the people of Europe ahead of the purity of some of the arguments about the European Union, and that there should not be an acceptance that we should have unnecessary disruption because political ideology is put ahead of that.
That's very interesting. That would indicate to me that you're now moving away from no deal and that you look for increased transition to prevent chaos. Is that a correct reading of what you just said?
No, I would not think that was a correct reading at all. I think that we need to come to an agreement in that time.
You give the correct reading of what you've just said.
As I say, I hope that we come to an agreement that doesn't put ideological concepts of countries having to be punished for having carried out what was their legitimate right under treaty and underpinned by the other 27 members.
What do you consider as punishment?
Concepts that say that the UK should be less well treated because it has decided to leave the European Union.
So is your feeling the UK should be as treated as well as it ever has inside the club and outside the club? Should it be treated like a EU member country then? Is punishment not being treated like an EU member country?
This is my entire argument, is that we've got to start to think about the businesses and the people and the jobs and the profits and not the ideology of the European Union.
So if the European Union was to treat the UK the way it treats Argentina, Brazil, Canada, countries starting with D, Dominican Republic, whatever, would that be punishment or would that be fair?
We are looking for a full, comprehensive and special relationship that reflects the fact that for 40 years we have been a member of the European Union, that we begin from a position of identity in regulation, unlike any other country that enters into a trade agreement with the European Union, and that we are the biggest market.
But I feel we're running around a wheel here, because now you're back to wanting a deal. So if you want this deal and you can't get this deal concluded by the time limit, would you want an extension on the time limit?
We go into a negotiation with a position set out that we think this is the time limit within which we should finish this. We cannot go into a deal on an open-ended basis. That's not a sensible basis for a negotiation.
Okay. People will make of that what they will. Can I ask, Secretary of State, how will splitting the EU's existing tariff rate quotas at the WTO be resolved in time for the UK to have its own separate WTO schedules by the time Brexit occurs? If it's in March 2019, if it's a 2-year transition, maybe luckily it might be a 300-year transition, but we'll see, in the post-Brexit transition period.
Well, the negotiations are going quite well. I was in Geneva 2 weeks ago. I had a number of discussions with a number of countries who'd expressed reservations to us. I explained what it was that we were doing, what about the concept of technical rectification, and how we saw that applying. Of course, the problem is not really with the United Kingdom in the disaggregation of the EU current quotas, because what we have said from the beginning...
Where does the problem lie?
Well, what we said from the beginning is that we wanted to see continued market access for 3 reasons, which I think I've mentioned here before. We want to see continued access for those countries who export to the United Kingdom. We don't want them to be disadvantaged. We don't want to see our own producers disadvantaged by seeing sudden shifts in market size and market share, and we don't want our consumers to be disadvantaged by increased prices should there be a market shock. So that's why we have said, for example, if country X already has 60% of the EU quota allowed that comes to Britain, that we would take that market share and call that our new quota. That fulfills, as far as I'm concerned, and most of the countries we've talked to, the concept of technical rectification.
Does it fulfill country access?
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. The problem comes then if the EU 27 decide to make their new quota the EU 28 minus what Britain has offered, because that is not a technical rectification under WTO rules. That's a modification and requires an Article 28 negotiation. So that's the problem at the present time. It sort of produces a slight paradox in that we could be leaving and disaggregating from the EU quotas, not in dispute with those countries who export to us, but the EU could find itself in a process of some dispute. Now, the easy way for that to be resolved is for the EU 27 not to alter their EU 28 quota. But that's a matter for them and not a matter for us.
You seem to be making a plea to the EU 27 to make some concessions to placate WTO members. Will you be making any further concessions, do you think, to WTO members who've objected to the splitting of the TRQs?
Well, we have, if you take specific examples, countries that have publicly raised that, then New Zealand might spring to mind for one. And what we said to them is we're opening up a process of a bilateral FTA, and it would seem unproductive to have the United Kingdom's capacity at WTO tied up in a process about TRQ disaggregation rather than be constructively moving to what the future trading relationship would be. And I find that when I've had face-to-face discussions, that people do understand our position. But it does, and I'm being very open. It does leave a problem for some of these countries in relation to the EU 27. But Chairman, we've made very clear that that is a matter for the EU 27 to sort after we leave. It's not a responsibility for the United Kingdom.
Interesting, I'm many watching that. Can I ask you also, Secretary of State, about the value of contracts held by UK businesses that would be lost if the UK failed to accede to the government procurement agreement by March 2019?
Well, the exact number is difficult to say, but of course we are about
the exact
20...
number that would be lost.
Well,
yeah.
yes, but whatever Britain would lose would also be lost in the other direction, possibly even greater numbers, which is why we've said that to the EU that they needed to put forward our schedules for independent GPA membership at the last Council, which they have now done for us. So I think that's one area where we've made genuine progress since I was last in front of this committee.
Taking your second point there, then if it was contracts coming in, that would mean higher public procurement, that would mean higher cost to central government if that agreement wasn't there, so you would be losing twice. You'd be losing for companies coming in, and you'd be losing for value for money from the UK government.
One of the reasons that we want continued membership of the GPA is that we think that introduces elements of competition to help bring prices down, potentially in the UK.
Has your department made any assessment of the value of these contracts that would be lost? Going back to my question.
I would have to write to Chairman on that if we have specific numbers. I have to say it has been difficult to ascertain exactly what that is and what the number in the opposite direction is. But if you're willing to accept the best estimates on that, then I'm certainly happy to provide the committee with what we have.
Yes, thank you. That would be welcome. Has any country asked the UK for any concessions in return for agreeing the accession?
Not so far, no.
Not so far. Can I move to Catherine Weston?
Sorry, Chairman, because I think they understand that because the public procurement offer that the United Kingdom has to make is so valuable, it's very worthwhile as being. I think we make up 25% in terms of the entire EU offer at present. So the lost opportunity to others, were Britain not to accede to the GPA, would be great.
Very optimistic words. Thank you.
Chair, you told the House it was far too hyperbolic to say the US was involved in an attack on the international order. Do you stand by that view, given that the US is imposing legally dubious tariffs and vetoing all appointments to the WTO's appellate body?
We have... we said that we understand why the US has concerns about the current system, and we share some of the analysis of the problems that we face. And in particular, the US worries about China on a number of fronts. On IP, which is what the 301 is intended to deal with, and in particular, forced tech transfer. Now, the argument that is often made in the other direction is that these companies don't have to do business in China, therefore they don't have to transfer their tech. That's not an argument I think stands up very well in international law. And we understand questions about overproduction of commodities like steel, and we understand the lack of transparency that exists in China about ownership. Is a steel company really private, or is it state-owned, and what's the level of crossover on that? We also understand questions about access, particularly to services markets. While we sympathise with the analysis, what we don't sympathise with is the remedy. We believe that to use the Article 232 of the appropriate US trade legislation on the grounds of national security has a twofold problem. The first is, if the principle is accepted, why would other countries not do the same and simply use national security as a pretext for protectionism? And secondly, as most of this committee will know, the WTO has shied away from giving opinions on what constitutes national security under WTO law since its inception. I think that this provides a potential existential problem at WTO.
And that could be a potential issue the UK could introduce into its own negotiations.
Well, we've had extensive discussions with the US, and our primary aim at the moment is how we get de-escalation of a situation, because we take the view that there are counter trends at work here. If, for example, you apply an external tariff on any element in your economy, simple supply and demand internally is likely to push those costs up, because internal producers can raise their prices without fear of competition from outside. That is likely to have an increase in input prices to a country, which sooner or later feed through to output prices and will make you less competitive. And I fail to understand economically how that helps to diminish a trade deficit. So I think that as we've seen recently, we've seen commercial, industrial business bodies in the United States actually say this could be harmful to UK domestic interests. We've been trying with our contacts in Congress and in American business to have those voices heard, because I think it's far more likely that any American administration pays a greater heed to its own business and political representatives than those from the outside. Nonetheless, we continue to make the case.
I'll just ask on the Hinkley C infrastructure project, what view you took on the involvement of China in that. I know it's a completely separate topic, but I'm just wondering sort of where you are on that question, which did come down to national security as an element of what is a massive project.
Well, that's subject to all sorts of analysis, which I'm sure the committee will understand. I certainly can't comment on in the committee. And I take the general view that we live in a competitive global economy, and if we want to be involved in infrastructure projects in other countries, and we want UK companies to be involved in those, and we want an open global trading environment, then we can't pick and choose. But we do have a perfect right under international law to ensure that elements of our critical national infrastructure and our national security are protected in the trade decisions that we take. And I think that where you can make a genuine national security case, I think that is compatible with WTO law. I think when you use national security as a pretext for protectionist measures that cannot actually be justified on national security grounds, that is a very different position altogether. And the UK would argue that as a country that supplies steel, and some very specific steel that's used in some very specific US military projects, that to then have tariffs applied to us on the grounds of national security is not a defensible position.
Thank you, Chair.
I see the Minister's on his feet, and there'll probably be a division, and if so, I'll suspend for 15 minutes, then we'll resume again, probably for another 15 minutes, Secretary of State. I am a humanitarian, I won't keep you too long.
I'm afraid, Chairman, I have a Privy Council meeting at Buckingham Palace.
We shall discuss that over the division if it happens.
Thank you, Chairman. Secretary of State, my question is on rollover agreements and grandfathering. So, which third countries have formally agreed to continue treating the UK as if it were still an EU member during the post-Brexit transition, so we can continue benefit for existing the EU trade and same agreements?
Well, we have ongoing discussions. So, for example, with Korea, South Korea, and with Switzerland, we've had extensive discussions on their wish to continue with that. And of the agreements that we have, we've not had indications, despite frequent discussions, that any country is unwilling to do so.
So they have agreed. So these two countries agreed.
Well, we are in the process of getting the agreement. Now, there are two scenarios, aren't there? There's one, if we leave with no deal at the 29th of March next year. And then, of course, there's the scenario if we continue through the IP, which will effectively be continuity of the agreement, although we still await the EU's notification formally of these countries on that.
So, okay, so you just mentioned if we have no deal by next March. So is there any country have agreed to continue trade on the same basis as we have agreement?
Yes, we have an agreement in principle from all those we've had discussions with.
Is that on paper?
I'm sorry?
Is it on paper?
No, I said we've had discussions. We'll want to come because we have agreements in place, and we've had discussions about what happens if we have to have an agreement that gives us just a bilateral rollover. But most of the countries are waiting to see now whether we have a longer period where we can then come to a bespoke agreement once we have the implementation period in place.
So all the countries you have spoken to have been very positive?
Yes.
Okay. Right.
Yeah, I said positive isn't really enough, is it? 'Cause it was only not even a year ago at the Conservative Party conference, 2017. Seems like a long time ago, but you promised there we would have 40 agreements, FTAs, in place the second after midnight.
And
in March 2019. Are you still standing by that
that's
promise?
our intention, indeed.
It's a promise.
It's our intention to do so. And
You'll have to in a no-deal scenario, won't you?
Well, and there is nothing in any of the discussions we've had with any countries that suggests that they don't want to continue having access to the world's 5th biggest economy.
Secretary of State, we'll give you an option here. There's a available option. We can suspend for 15 minutes and come back for 15 minutes, or we can suspend now and come back in September for a longer session. I will put this in your hands and give you the choice. I'm sure that the material will not have diminished by September, but still we're available in your desk, so you can have a choice at this moment.
That was not much of a choice, Chairman.
But you can come back
Or
at
at least,
quarter
at least it was choice with direction. And yes, but as long as I'm able to leave by 4:30, because I do have to.
For which we shall aim for 4:30. Can we try and all be back from this division by 10 past? That means getting through the lobbies quickly. Suspend the sitting for a moment. I think you had the floor before the adjournment. Can I thank people for being back so prompt? 12 minutes. Good. Chris Leslie?
Yeah, it was just to finish off this point about the free trade agreements with non-EU countries and the promise, or as you say, the intention to have 40 of them all signed, sealed, legally, 1 second after midnight.
That is still our intention.
Yeah, but the intention is to have. Well, at what point will we get legal texts? Because 1 second after midnight is leaving it a little bit late to have the legal texts for Parliament to see. So, do you anticipate we'll have all 40 of those legal texts, not unreasonably, by the end of this calendar year?
Well, as quickly as we can achieve them, that's what we want. It gives us maximal certainty.
Your hope that by the end of this year?
Well, I hope as soon as possible.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Faisal Rashid.
Thank you, Chairman. Secretary of State, question on export finance. Can you explain why UK export finance, on the last figures available, gives 99.4% of its energy-related support to fossil fuels? This flies in the face of the government's commitment to be a leader on climate change, especially given the Committee on Climate Change's recent report that the government is not doing enough to halt climate change. Have you taken any steps to change this situation in the UK export finance?
Yes, we have, and we've had discussions with UK export finance to say that where there is investment in fossil fuels, particularly coal, which is moving to cleaner technology, then we can continue to do that. But when it comes to the setting up of brand new coal installations, I'm not in favour of that.
Okay, will you commit to the committee on briefing on what percentage of energy-related support UKEF intends to give to fossil fuel projects going forward?
Well, that depends. If it's a country, say a developing economy, whose only source of fuel is coal, then clearly it's in line with our international obligations to try to help diminish, if we can, the emissions that they have, so that makes sense. But what it would not be, for example, sensible to do would be to help countries like China set up new coal-powered energy generation. So I've also been looking with UKEF to see how we can, at the same time, be increasing the amount of investment that we help countries make in renewables. And I think, for example, as I mentioned, I think in the House of Commons last week, I was with Equinor in Oslo a couple of weeks ago to see how we might work with them to ensure that we could use wind turbines and help promote the use of wind turbines in other parts of the world, which might otherwise be using fossil fuels. So as well as trying to encourage, where we can, cleaner versions of fossil fuel use that exist at the present time, I also think we should be using UKEF to try to increase the use of renewables.
Okay, I'll understand.
But it's not possible for me off the top of my head to produce you a figure that would be in any way reliable and wouldn't be fair to the committee.
Totally understand. Let me put it a different way then. So, will you commit to having UK Export Finance's operations and support adhere to the Paris Agreement, which the UK government has committed to?
Yes, and as I said, where we're able to invest, for example, in countries that already have coal-powered generation, but we're able to do it in a cleaner way, where they have no other option in terms of energy generation, that's one thing. But we would also want to try to use UKEF in the future to expand the use of renewables.
Very quickly, Chair, very quickly. You mentioned China, supporting, we can't, into fossil fuels and stuff. But I've got really some figures here. A private eye and unearthed investigation that took place last year revealed that October 2013, UKEF guaranteed a 45 million loan to Cyber Holding, a Russian chemical company, part owned by Putin's son-in-law. UK Export Finance also provided 109 million between 2011 and 2016 for equipment for Russian coal mines. So are these the types of investments that UKEF will continue to make in the current political climate? Or how does this fit with the government's climate change commitments?
Well, 2013 UK were not part of the Department for International Trade. And anything done between 2011 and 2016 was before my department came into being. All I can say is the guidelines that I mentioned is that we have had a look at that. We had occasion to look at it because of a particular investment decision in Southeast Asia last year, in which case I wasn't willing to sign off. As I say, the guidelines that I've given is where there is energy generation that cannot be done in a different way, but can be done in a cleaner way, then that's acceptable for us to help. But at the same time, we would want to try to encourage other forms of energy generation and, if possible, an increased use of renewables. But in some countries it's not possible. In some countries, their basic resource is coal. The question is, can we get them to do it in a cleaner way on their way to developing potential other forms of generation?
Thank you. Chris Leslie,
sorry to dot back to the facilitated customs arrangement issue again. But it seems to me that if it were to work, the idea is that UK would collect the EU's tariffs, but reciprocally, the EU would potentially have to collect the UK's tariffs if hypothetically the UK went higher, for that to work. You need a sort of parallel, a mirroring system. Would you agree that reciprocity, if that reciprocity is not there, the thing couldn't work?
I accept the problem, but I think there's another way to deal with the problem. I can't say too much because we'll see what comes out in the white paper once we've finished the ministerial right round. But this was one of the areas where I had concerns. My specific concern on the original model was around circumvention, where the UK to operate a trade remedies policy where the UK tariff was higher than the EU tariff, and what would be done in that case. But it would be possible, for example, in that case, for anyone who is importing into the United Kingdom to have to ensure by a legal duty that they paid the correct tariff, subject to a criminal penalty. That would be possible. But I can't say any more than that, given where we are.
The reason I ask specifically is that you will have seen today the European Reform Group, the ERG group of Conservative members of Parliament, Mr Rees-Mogg, member for North Somerset and others, have tabled an amendment on this very question to the trade bill for next week, or the customs bill for next week. And they've said if there is no reciprocity, then you wouldn't be able to operate a facilitated customs arrangement. So what would the government do in respect of that amendment?
That will. Well, I haven't seen the amendments, and I'll have to go look at the amendments this evening. But it is an issue that I recognised quite early on in the process, that there had to be a mechanism that did not allow circumvention of a UK trade remedies policy.
That's the fourth or fifth issue. The problem with this facilitated customs agreement.
And we think there is an answer to that, which lies in a legal duty, but it will be set out. That will be dealt with in the white paper.
Thank you. Secretary of State, just if we cooperate with each other, we'll probably get us all finished in time for your meetings. The OECD analysis published in April 2018 reported that in 2017 the UK recorded the lowest level of FDI inflows since 2005 at just 15 billion. In addition, the DTI's latest figures show the number of inward FDI projects fell 9% from 2016 to 2017 to 2018, How would you explain these figures? And I know a Brexit referendum happened around the area, but let's leave that.
Well, there are two issues. One is that, as the committee will all know, that the global FDI fell. The question is where we sit relative to other countries in terms of FDI. So last year, the FDI projects coming into the UK created another 76,000 new jobs in the UK. We were, by a clear margin, the #1 destination for investment into Europe, and we were the third biggest global destination for foreign direct investment. If you actually look at the figures for other countries, you will see that there was a drop in relation to the global FDI drop. Some of that was attributed to America First, some of it was related to what we think were capital movement restrictions in China. But the point is that the United Kingdom, despite all the predictions, remains the top destination. And interestingly, if you look at the country investments into the UK, one of the countries with the biggest rise in FDI into the United Kingdom at an astonishing 60% was Germany.
Thank you very much. On the export strategy, when is the long-awaited strategy due for publication? There's a feeling in this that there's been a number of false starts. And will the export strategy only focus on trade promotion, as is rumoured? And when would other sections of the strategy be expected?
Well, the export strategy is now at its point of final clearance, and it's now a question of when we are able to obtain, as those who've been in government know, the appropriate government slot for its publication. But it's ready. I'm also keen to pursue, at the same time, because I think they're related, extensions to the government's foreign direct investment strategy. And what that, in very broad terms, will want to do is to see how we can make projects more visible to foreign direct investors. At the moment, it's very easy for big sovereign funds, big institutional investors to see the government's infrastructure projects, for example, but it's very difficult for them to see local government projects, for example, which may be investable, but are not necessarily big enough for those institutions to see. So we're trying to, and we will produce a vehicle which will make it easier so that foreign direct investment into the country is not coming into property in London, but actually directed into sectors of the economy that will produce greater economic return for the UK in line with our industrial strategy.
Turning briefly to trade remedies, is it possible for you to clarify the dumping methodology that will be used in the UK's post-Brexit regime, how the dumping margins will be calculated? Also, there's concern in industry that the Trade Remedies Authority and the Secretary of State will each conduct their own economic interest tests over complicated matters, and also leaving too high a burden of proof on industry. How do you respond to those charges?
Well, it's impossible for me to go through all the methodology in 2 minutes, Chairman.
Okay.
And I'm very happy to write because what we are looking at is to see how we can look at the best. That's operated
will you or the TRA be conducting independent?
No, there'll be a single economic test that will be conducted by the TRA. Okay. And the reason for the economic test is that we would want to. Well, first of all, there are two things. We'd want to ensure that in any action that was taken, we'd made a proper assessment about what the consequential cost to other parts of industry might be. But also, I'm very keen that we look in taking such measures to see where there might be a disproportionate regional effect, because it may well be that an economic test applied across the whole United Kingdom didn't necessarily show us that there was a trans-UK effect, but it might be a disproportionate effect in one region that might require us to take action. So I'm very keen that we develop a test that is sensitive to the UK's interests in those circumstances.
Two final points to raise. A lot of time has passed in the last 2 years. At one stage, EU citizens were talked of as being types of bargaining chips or main cards in negotiations. Do you think that was a mistake? Do you think those days have gone now? And in the past, will they remain?
I think that it's legitimate to ask the European Union in any negotiation that the rights of UK citizens are treated with as much respect in other parts of the European Union as European Union citizens in the United Kingdom.
Okay, people will make of that as they will. Time is pushing us. Secretary of State, from today, I think if I summarise it, we're going along, the theme of a dying dream seems to be one that was there. The common rule book was described actually as an EU rule book. The pharmaceutical sector will be at the EU using REACH, which will be welcomed by them, I'm sure. Car importations were seen as a disappointment by Brexiteer from the United States Brexiteer members. An FTA with the United States of America doesn't seem to be what it once was. The Brexit supporting members here were quite disappointed that the ministers resigning were Brexit supporting ministers and not Remain type ministers.
I'm not sure disappointed.
But the environment, there's an environment of complete uncertainty, it seems, around the WTO at the moment. That a lot of red lines there. But we do have your own 5 red lines, which are no free movement, no payment to the European Union, no European Court of Justice, no customs union, and no single market. I think from today we have gathered all this, and this is a process of learning. Hopefully we'll have you back in a few months' time in this capacity. Can we thank you, Minister, for being here today? I understand you have other pressing engagements, and I will release you to go and do those now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Committee.
Order.